Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the City of Bellingham Transportation Benefit District meeting. It's March 23rd, 2015. All board members are present. We don't have any minutes to review. Financial review, Mr. Henshaw.
Okay, I thought, weren't there minutes to approve? Do you want to
we do
approve
have
minutes?
minutes.
We do
I'm
have
sorry. Okay, has everybody had a chance to read the minutes? And is there a motion?
Move approval. Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, motion carries 7-0. Okay.
Does Dan want to abstain?
Oh,
This is from like November.
you read them? That's fine. Okay, thanks. Okay.
All right, thank you. Brian Henshaw, Finance Department. I was going to just give a real quick, brief overview of the TBD finances for 2014. Just a couple of highlights. You'll see here $4.7 million of sales tax. That's generated by the 0.2% that was voted in. We also had a little bit of interest, 28,000 or 27,000. Sorry, this is the actual. And then a transfer over for a project, the Indian Street pedestrian project, transferred into the TBD of about $18,000. So out of the $4.7 million, we had admin charges of just under $48,000. This year it's a little bit higher. It was the first year that the TBD district was audited by the state auditors, so that added a couple $1,000s in charges from the state. We net all that out, we're just below $4.7 million, and then as the one-third policy decision goes, we had a contract with WTA. This is net of a credit at the end of the year of about $28,000. So total WTA charges were $1,346,000. We also paid for, out of the reserves for the WTA projects, the Whatcom Creek Bridge restoration repair work that had to be done. So we had $1,600,000 of expenditures out of the transit portion. The repaving portion this year, we had just under $1,500,000. And then in non-motorized, we had about $1,700,000. So as we continue to move forward into 15 and 16, the budgeted backlog makes up the difference between any of these, and we're right about 33% on each of the divisions of the expenditures. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Any questions? Okay. Thank you, Brian. Next is 2014 project review.
Thank you, Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. There is a requirement that there's an annual Transportation Benefit District report. So in your packet is a written report. It comes out of the annual transportation report that we do. It used to be called our transportation report on annual concurrency. But this year we added a chapter on TBD, and we've changed the name to the Transportation Report on Annual Mobility, the TRAM, and we included that chapter in your packet, so you have that information. I'm going to briefly go through some of the highlights for 2014. I don't think we need to spend much time on this. This is just a little bit of history on the Transportation Benefit District. It does expire in 2021, so something to be aware of, that it was a 10-year levy. The last year will be 2021. As Brian said, we've identified 3 projects. The council has approved, or the TBD board has approved 3 projects that are eligible for the Transportation Benefit District funding. These projects are all included on the 6-year Transportation Improvement Program. Brings in around $4.5 million a year, and we contract with WTA for enhanced transit services. You'll be hearing a little bit more about that later in the agenda today. That contract with WTA does expire currently at the end of December 2015. So some of the projects that were completed in 2014, 3 major paving projects: Hawthorne Road, Electric Avenue, and 14th Street. And on Hawthorne and 14th, we were able to, along with the resurfacing project, to include projects out of the bicycle master plan. So those were repaved, and shared lanes were included, which were identified in the bicycle master plan. Electric Avenue doesn't have dedicated bicycle facilities, but as part of the paving project, we certainly improved the shoulder. So it does have a widened shoulder. The transit projects that the board have approved in the past, we have the extended Sunday service, additional service on Route 196, and additional service on Route 401, which is the red GO line. In addition to the service enhancements, the board did approve money to go to physical capital improvements at the transit station in Bellis Fair. This was to provide a bus pullout, made it safer for the buses to navigate that area, and some pedestrian improvements as well. In talking to WTA, that project is nearly completed the design portion of it. They're about 90%, and they do anticipate construction this year on that project. The board approved up to $225,000 of TBD money to go towards that project. A couple other projects that were approved by the board, and one of them is completed. The top one is not there. That's the South Bay Trail active lights. That's the railroad crossing. That's a project that the city's working on right now with Burlington Northern. We actually have an approved contract with Burlington Northern. We're hopeful that that project gets built this year. That will add all of the necessary safety measures at the pedestrian crossing at the north end of Boulevard Park. Yes, Jack?
Is it true that the railroad itself will be doing the contracting, and they'll actually be doing it and we're just simply reimbursing?
They will actually be doing the work. The city has already performed some of the work. So the approaches to the crossing, we've gone in and we did some improvements there, paved a section of the trail as it approaches the crossing. But when we work with the rail, all of the work within the actual rail line and their right-of-way is performed by BNSF contractors, and we have a contract with them and we reimburse them their actual costs. And that's consistent with all of the work that is done within the crossings throughout the city. It's always Burlington Northern that does the work. So again, we hope that that gets completed this year, and that was funded by a combination of TBD non-motorized and parks funding. And the second one is a project that is complete, and you're all aware of that the portion of Whatcom Creek Trail, the bridge that was damaged by fire, that project has been completed. Parks finished that job, and that was partially funded by TBD money as well. 25th Street, that's Bill McDonald to Douglas. That was the second highest ranked project on the pedestrian master plan, so that has been completed. It turned out really nicely. Provides nice pedestrian connectivity near the university. And there's the project. Here are the projects that are identified for 2015. And after the city adopted the pedestrian master plan and the bicycle master plan, it has made it very nice to go off of those projects that had a really comprehensive public process, identified projects, ranked the projects, and it makes it much easier to identify where the non-motorized money will be targeted. This year we'll be completing sidewalk improvements on Eliza. Once that section of Eliza between Westerly and Kellogg is completed, that will essentially complete the pedestrian system in Cordata in terms of sidewalk connections. There's still some intersection and crossing improvements, but in terms of sidewalks, that's the final missing link. A few meetings ago, the council approved removal of parking on Ohio Street. That will allow us to do bike lanes from Cornwall to Grant. That'll work nicely with some other pedestrian improvements that will be also happening along Ohio. U Street sidewalk, that's just south of Alabama.
Ed, is that the same street that Hoagland Pharmacy is on, or not?
On
Off of Alabama, and you take a right on U?
Yeah, so it's right near the where the 7-Eleven is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Right.
and so a few years ago we did the west side. This year we'll be doing the east side of U, and that'll complete the improvements there just south of Alabama. State and Laurel. A couple of years ago we did State and Maple. State and Laurel, this will be intersection improvements, crossings, bulb outs, all pedestrian safety in line with the pedestrian master plan. Birchwood Avenue, that's the sidewalk right in front of Maury's. Council approved, or TBD board approved last year. We're under design. It has a parks component as well, that stairwell down to the trail. I just spoke with Leslie Bryson. The sidewalk is a little bit further along in terms of design and working with the property owners, so we're hopeful to build the sidewalk this year. The stairwell will not be constructed in 15, but potentially in 16. That'll be nice to get that completed. That's been on the council's radar for quite a while. And then Lincoln Street sidewalk, this is a project that's in conjunction with WTA as well as Western near the Park and Ride facility. Sidewalks adjacent to the Park and Ride, and at the same time, quite a bit of sidewalk work on the other side of Lincoln that's being funded through private development. So when we look at that section of Lincoln between Lakeway and heading up towards Samish Interchange, adding quite a bit of pedestrian connectivity throughout that section of Lincoln. So this is the cycling side of it, bicycle side of the improvements, bicycle boulevards. We talked a lot about this during the adoption of the 6-year TIP. Many of these projects are in the Roosevelt neighborhood. The focus is to work in conjunction with the Alabama Street improvements that are happening this year. That will include active crossings, including 2 new Hawk signals along Alabama. That will work in conjunction with the bicycle boulevards that will bring folks down from the Alabama area, Roosevelt, and utilize the undercrossing of Kentucky and Nevada underneath the interstate, which, as we know, the interstate has been is a barrier to both bicycle and pedestrian access throughout the city. This is a list of projects that will be completed both in 2015 and 2016. And these projects down on the south side near the Happy Valley Elementary School, working in conjunction with the school district, some improvements there on 24th and Mill. We'll be completing some intersection improvements and bicycle boulevards in that area. We have some pictures of the wayfinding. That's a project that's underway right now. The pedestrian or the bicycle master plan identified some guidance for wayfinding, but that's a project that is still being worked on by Planning and Public Works, identifying how we sign and provide directions for folks using both the bicycle boulevards as well as the greenways system. So that's something that is still being developed and will come back to council at some point this year prior to installation of the wayfinding. And resurfacing this year, Eliza in conjunction with the sidewalk project, and then some projects on down 30th Street from Connolly to Old Fairhaven Parkway, as well as Monroe Street from Lafayette to Cherry Streets. And so we usually put out a complete overlay project that it consists of both TBD funding, which is around $1.5 million, along with the $2 million or so funds that come out of the street fund, and put out one project. This year, Alabama Street will be the primary project for the street fund portion of the overlay. So these are the streets that are being resurfaced using TBD money.
Any questions for Ted? Dan?
Ted, I'm trying to understand how the Kentucky underpass will work in terms of that being a bicycle corridor. So as you egress, if you're coming west, you would run into a 4-way stop, and then another 4-way stop right by Hardware Sales, and then there's James Street. There is the crossing there, but I'm wondering how families with bikes, or with bikes and children, would be able to traverse that section safely.
Across James Street?
Well, just prior to James Street, in between James and I-5 there, just because there's so much traffic with Hardware Sales coming in and out of there.
And so one of the things that we're focusing on with the bicycle boulevards is, and these are currently under design, is how do we make improvements, physical improvements at the intersections or throughout the corridors to give priority to the non-motorized motion, to the bicycles. And so we can do that through treatments. There's 4-way stops there. Just identifying at the stops through markings that cyclists have, that is a primary cyclist route. There'll be signage. In some areas, we'll be narrowing the intersections down. I haven't seen the design for that full section there, but the concept is we use lower volume streets, and even though there's a lot of activity there throughout that section of town, that has been identified as the best way to get people under the interstate. We'll have to make sure that we provide all of the markings and signage to create a safe way through there for bicycle boulevards. But when we get the design done, we'll come back to council and share that with you.
Michael?
I have 2 things to say. They're just comments, really. One is, This is actually some of the most exciting stuff that the city does, in the sense that providing public infrastructure is what the public sector, local government does. This is when I often feel like we're doing the best for our community. This is the one thing, building these sorts of things, taking care of the roads, that we and only we can do. And I'm really always happy when we're doing them. And every project makes me feel happier. If you go to page 4 of this presentation, there was a very small thing I thought was rather significant. That little image up in the corner that we're stamping the concrete on our projects. We have this commitment to a sense of place here in Bellingham, and in some of our older neighborhoods, you see these stamps with the name of the contractor. 1932, some company put in that street. I think these sort of stamps actually create a sense of place in history, and maybe you were just building sidewalks, but I don't know if you realize that you were actually adding to one of our legacies by putting a piece of history down at the same time.
Is there any way you can put the board members' names on, or no? Just kidding. That may look like a grave. We're not going to do that. Okay.
But this is actually, it's a really good point that Councilmember Lillquist raises. The Transportation Commission spent a lot of time thinking about how we identify the improvements that are funded through Transportation Benefit District dollars. So you'll see both the stamps and the concrete, but also signage up there, Transportation Benefit District signage, really wanting to make sure that the citizens who voted for the 0.2% sales tax understand that those dollars are going towards these types of projects. So it is a good point, and one that the Transportation Commission has really emphasized. We need to make sure that we're properly marking these facilities so that people understand how they were funded.
Thank you.
Ted, I have a question for you. On page 11, it says further study for Holly and Lakeway. I'm going to throw something kind of crazy out there, but I'm wondering, in regards to our study of Holly and Lakeway and State Street, whether we've been talking about eliminating our one-ways and changing those downtown, eliminating our one-ways.
Oh.
And it seems to be a topic that's come up a lot lately. I'm on the wayfinding and through tourism, and I'm wondering if that's something that we have. I don't know what the history of talking about that is. I know it's pretty crazy. I'm throwing that out there right now. But it seems to be coming up a lot. I don't know if this is appropriate forum, but I'm wondering if this is something that we could throw on the discovery when we're looking at resurfacing and looking at our one-way streets downtown.
It is something that comes up from time to time, and it did come up early on when the city was working on the downtown neighborhood plan, and it's come up many times in the past, and there's been several studies that have been done on it over the years, because there's always interest in whether or not the downtown would be served better with a two-way system versus the one-way couplet. The current thinking is that the one-way system is the most efficient. We've done a lot of improvements down there to support the one-way system, and it works very well with transit, for one. It would be extremely expensive to go back to a two-way system. All of the intersections would need to be rebuilt. All of the signals would need to be rebuilt. And transit would really have to rethink how they serve downtown. There's been a lot of studies on it, and we certainly could come back to the board or to the council and go over those. During the downtown planning process, it was determined that the best course of action would be to keep the one-way couplets, but work on making sure that we provide safe routes for all of the various modes, working with transit, working on the pedestrian crossings, and wayfinding to make sure people could get around, because we understand that if you're not from the area, the one-way system you're not used to it, and so we need to make sure
Even when you're from here.
We need to make sure that it's signed well. But it's not something as part of the Holly project or State Street that is part of the current scope. What we're working on Holly is looking at, is there an opportunity to create a bicycle facility that would potentially take one of the lanes and use have a physical separation like you see with the cycle tracks or the physically separated bicycle lanes. That's part of the further study. We need to make sure that the system would actually function that way, make sure that we have the capacity to do that. On State Street, it's really looking more at how do we use the additional space. We know that we have a lot of width there, more than we need. And should that width be used for additional pedestrian environment, gathering areas for pedestrians, kind of pedestrian plazas, or potentially parking. So those are the things that are being weighed. under both the Holly and the State Street project. And there's an active project on that. The city staff, Public Works and Planning have a consultant on board, and there'll be a public process looking at how should we move forward those facilities. Lakeway is a very difficult one. Obviously, there's a high volume on Lakeway. It was identified as a barrier through the bicycle master plan, and we just need to figure out how do we deal with the undercrossing of I-5. There's just not a lot of room there, and how do we deal with that? Or do we just identify alternative routes that are safer and better in the long run? So those needed study beyond what we could do through the bicycle master planning process. But we are not currently looking at changing the one-way system back to a two-way system. But we would certainly be happy to come back to council if you wanted further discussion on that.
Terry?
Yeah, you're right. This issue has been one that's come up a number of times. I think it was 20 years ago we did the downtown development workshop. It come up then, and I think it was probably about 10 years ago, Transpo, we brought it up, the council brought it up to look at because there was a lot of community input from downtown, and Transpo was hired to do a study of the streets downtown, and again, it's come back, and pretty much as Ted had said, it's been raised a few different times to look at it, and each time the efficiency and cost and stuff has come. But I understand the concern with it.
Roxanne?
Pertaining to the actual annual report, one of the things that I really value out of it is that it shows that we're doing this work in such different sections of our community. And that really gets to the fact that we're serving our whole district in all of this. So I just wanted to say I really appreciated that. I hope that'll continue.
Thank you.
Dan?
Ted, how do these wayfinding signs work in conjunction with the city wayfinding signs that are installed as a result of the WashDOT I-5 signage? Will there be separate signs for those businesses, or are they going to be in conjunction with this?
These particular wayfindings are really these will be for bicycles and won't be for folks regionally, but more localized. How do you get from one section of the city to another section? So for instance, how do you get from the Roosevelt area to downtown? And to have signage that specifically shows the best route to do that. Another key component to it is, as I mentioned briefly, is how do they function with the greenways system? Because we do have greenways trails like the railroad trail that are clearly a transportation link, and folks that are trying to get throughout town utilize those, as well as we hope will use the bicycle boulevard system. So they're really very much different than the destination signs you see on the interstate for businesses that also have signage from the interstate to those businesses. These will be more at the level of cyclists. We may have some pedestrian level signs as well, but it's a little bit challenging in terms of where do you start when you don't have a complete network. You're just building segments at a time, and you want to make sure that you're sending people to an area where they're going to have a safe way to get from here to there, even though the whole system may not be constructed yet.
Jack?
Just to add on for Dan, there is an effort in the community development section of the planning department to expand and enhance the wayfinding, especially in the downtown area, but I think citywide. So that there are going to be larger signs than the bicycle or pedestrian ones.
Thank you.
Okay, with no further questions, we will now go. Thanks, Ted.
So I do want to, we may not have time. We were going to ask Jim McCabe to do a brief summary of the Transportation Commission, but we do have one action that requires board approval today. So I'm wondering if we should do that first, which is the transit discussion. So perhaps we'll go to that and then have Jim do a Transportation Commission update after that. So Pete, do you want to come up? So in your packet is a request from WTA to consider an extension of the...
It's on page 11.
Yeah, of the transit services contract. And as I mentioned briefly in the presentation, that transit services contract expires at the end of 2015. The WTA board is requesting an extension of 1 year, which would allow WTA to complete their strategic planning effort, which is underway right now, They presented that, WTA presented that to the Transportation Commission, and in your packet is a resolution where the Transportation Commission supports a one-year extension. The timing is critical because it takes about 6 months for WTA to change their routing if there is a change in service. So Pete is here to answer any questions. Pete Stark, General Manager of WTA, to answer any questions. But staff and the Transportation Commission do support a one-year extension of the contract to allow that planning effort to conclude.
Okay. Go ahead, Pete. You want to say a few words?
Just a few.
Okay, that's good.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, first of all, thank you for the support of WTA. This arrangement has provided the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, we've hauled 1.2 million passengers thanks to this agreement. It has been a lifesaver to keep Sunday service in place in the community. So as this funding was first set up to sustain WTA while our finances stabilized. At this point, our finances are stable or are nearly stable, and the emerging issue now is how should WTA serve the 200,000 citizens of Whatcom County over the coming years? And that's our key question, our strategic planning process. We know the community's changed. We have much more interest in long-distance trips across Whatcom County. We have a mighty reason as far as carbon reduction to offer those trips. Growth in Ferndale isn't where our service is. Bellingham is developing rapidly. I've made a point last month just to drive around our changing neighborhoods and some of our coming developments. So we're going to have big challenges in front of us. As we face the future of the TBD, frankly, I would prefer to keep this contract going for a year and not have it be a distraction in the middle of the planning process and put a pause on it and think, well, what do we do about the money going away? Our finances are good, but we do face a couple of headwinds. We're losing about $500,000 a year of state funding. Of course, our sales tax has come back, but not as fast as the cities has. Canadian dollar's down, the local economy's up. There's several uncertainties out there, and I'd rather address them all through the strategic planning process than address the issues one at a time. Our board agreed with that, and that's why they directed me to approach you to seek a one-year extension.
Thank you, Pete. Questions, comments? Jack?
Yeah, for as much as being also a WTA board member, this is kind of an awkward thing, but I've talked this over with Pete too. The agency is doing okay financially, and it seems like our agreement that we set up when the TBD was initially established was that we would have Sunday service supported by the TBD board up until the time that the agency could then reassume it through their own budget. And while, given the fact that the strategic plan is going to be done by WTA this year and it won't be finished until sometime next year, and it'll probably take at least a half a year, maybe up to a year to go and implement those changes. We're still talking a couple of years out. But to me, it seems like I would feel as a TBD board member that it would be more responsible to negotiate a different arrangement than what we currently have. And what I would throw out is that we would that we would supply 2/3 of the funding this year, with the WTA supplying the other 1/3 of the cost of Sunday service. Well, at the end of this contract extension, I guess this would be for 2016, with the understanding that we would be pretty much weaned off of any Sunday service at the end of the approval of the strategic plan, that we would be able to use the cost savings off of something like that for other projects that would help cover some of the capital streetscape improvements, which I think would be very important for the city, not just for our own streetscape issues, but also to help promote, further boardings by people that use the service in Bellingham. So I guess what I would do is I would move to amend the the proposed agreement in here that would allow for 2/3 of the cost of Sunday service to be covered by the TBD and 1/3 by the WTA agency.
Is there a second? Okay, no second. Well, Michael?
I actually have a question, Jack. I'm not entirely sure what you're suggesting. We have a contract with WTA right now, which expires
In December.
in December, and your proposal, rather than giving a one-year extension, is to give a one-year extension only at 2/3 funding level?
Correct.
Okay.
That's what it is.
And the logic is that this begins the weaning process, which WTA, everyone knows, needs to start occurring.
That's correct.
I will second your motion.
Okay, motion made and seconded. Roxanne?
Yeah, it is interesting to serve on the WTA board and the TBD. I agree with Jack that we need to start this kind of weaning process because we have so many projects in our TBD that also need funding. But this whole Sunday service thing was really meant to be a Band-Aid. And contrary to what my mother taught me about ripping off a Band-Aid, maybe what I'd like to do is soak it in some water. So, Jack, would you be willing to consider maybe half a 50 split?
You mean like do it in 2 steps that way? Yeah, I could see doing something like that because it's. I think as far as the capital money that we could be able to spend, also assisting WTA is certainly valuable. I think to both the city and into future bus service. I could support half.
What?
Dan?
Half, Michael, it would be half. So what would happen in 2016, from what I'm understanding, what Roxanne's saying is that the TBD board would supply 50% of the cost of Sunday service in 2016. WTA would supply 50% instead of what I was proposing, which was 2/3, 1/3. So that would be, roughly, because it's approximately, $1 million for Sunday service, so it'd be about $500,000 is what we would provide for 2016. And
the entirety of the contract with WTA is closer to the 1.5.
well, the entirety, but that's for I'm just looking for Sunday service.
So I guess we'd need to figure that out. If you're only talking about Sunday service, then we'd have to get that number and figure out 50% of that. The WTA contract is $1.4 million, and that was last year. So I don't know.
But we had other services that we were contracting out for other routes.
Mm-hmm.
And this was specifically for Sunday service because that was really the primary, as Roxanne was saying, this is the primary reason why we were going and setting up the TBD in the first place, was to try and restore, as it was associated with transit, that we were trying to restore Sunday service.
Terry?
I'm not quite sure that I agree with when we put this for the voters that it was just for the Sunday service. We put it out there as a 1/3, 1/3 split because we wanted to save Sunday service, but we're also looking at the importance of the bus system and the possibility of, if this one gets through, of supporting expansion of services in general in the city core, because we're trying to move this from a rider-dependent system to something that works for more people, where you can use on a regular basis for work and stuff. So I think a number of people that voted for that, was the idea of doing a third split through it, regardless of whether it's Sunday service or whatever, but it's to improve and increase bus service to the citizens of Bellingham.
Right, but when it was being campaigned on, it wasn't the transit component of it. And I agree about the 1/3 part of it, but the transit component of it really had more to do about Sunday service. And yet we have a lot of other opportunities, especially through a strategic plan. We'd have a lot more opportunities of taking money that we don't necessarily have to spend from TBD's perspective on Sunday service in the future, because, as Roxanne said, it really was a Band-Aid, that we could then go and use it for other things, maybe a downtown circulator, maybe additional GO lines, whatever it would be, or what I would prefer would be maybe more bus pullouts, shelters, Opticon systems, other types of things that I think we could support a lot better than through that type of funding source than to go and simply subsidize an operating line that the agency's running.
I understand why they're only asking for a one-year extension. Obviously, we're not going to be able to vote on anything today if we don't have, the numbers Brian has to get. We're going to have to schedule another TBD meeting. I guess we're going to have to vote on whether to go down that route or not. But I think, for myself, I think asking for a one-year extension is good. We could have this conversation again a year from now. I would say that probably one of the most popular elements of this, when this went to the voters, was to restore Sunday service. Sure, it does bring in a lot of money for streets and roads, but there was a lot of clamor out there when Sunday service was stopped. I mean, it really, if that wasn't in this whole package, I don't know if that would have passed. I'm not a pundit. I don't know. I'm just saying that because that's the way I feel. But I'm more inclined to go ahead and renew this for 1 year and have this discussion again maybe a year from now and start that weaning process and see where they're at financially. Because the worst thing that could happen is go down this road now and then realize they'll have to come back. So, I don't know. Michael.
Well, I've talked a long time about we need to start or figure out when we're going to start the weaning process. And that's why I supported your proposal, cutting it back by a third, starting in 2016. That seemed like a good way to start. I don't think cutting it back by half, I think, is a bigger surprise and a bigger start that I'm willing to support at this point, certainly without understanding better, as you maybe do as WTA board members. We were told that their finances are healthier, but I don't really know that. And so I guess I'm not willing to go all the way to the half. I'm willing to go to the third. I think that's a small message. That's a $250,000 message for Sunday service. It's, I'm not willing to go to the half at this point.
Pinky, then Terry.
I tend to agree with Jean right now. I would rather vote for a year extension. You guys are in the middle of your comp plan and trying to figure things out, and it seems to me if we just get all convoluted with dividing the funding, there's a lot of people are going to have to figure a lot of things out compared to what you've been working on right now. So I think Sunday service is vital. I don't want to see us lose it, and I don't want to see any changes in that in the near future. So personally, I'm willing to go with the year extension, and then you guys can figure out how it'll be paid for in the future.
Terry, then Roxanne.
Yeah, I kind of agree with this. Given that the Transportation Committee and staff, are recommending that we go along with this extension, I can support it. I do, know that we do have to start making that transition and start looking at, after that, how are we going to best use this to serve the citizens of Bellingham, because I want to continue using our third to fund those projects. But
Roxanne.
In preparation for figuring out how we do this in the long run, I beg you all to please look at the funding of the WTA. So this is really hard for us to sit through as WTA board members and city council members. As the tide rises for WTA, we constantly have to evaluate if our city funding through the TBD is the best thing for the organization and our city. So please look at the numbers of the WTA, especially since we'll have a lot more sustainability in this year and next year to really think about that, looking at the way you guys are talking about it. But watch that and figure it out with us, because we're just two members up there trying to reconcile this into two disparate situations.
Dan.
To clarify, so at the end of this weaning process, would that mean the elimination of Sunday service?
No, they pay for it.
No,
Okay.
not at all.
Okay.
No, this is what it is basically changing the funding source from from the TBD board to WTA.
Michael?
Well, okay, so I think it's interesting that the two WTA board members who do know WTA's finances are the two who are supporting the weaning process starting now. I'm feeling like you have information I don't have, and I would kind of like to have it.
Well, Pete, could you share with us maybe what some of the reserve issues are within WTA? I mean, I didn't want to go down that route, but
Well, we had a successful year this past year. Our expenses came in significantly under budget. Our revenue was on budget, pretty much within a small fraction of 1%. We were able to build reserves this year. Some part of that is going to be committed toward our fare collection project and toward operational improvement projects, which will lower our overall cost of business in the long run. That said, we're in a reasonably strong position. I do have some headwind, as I said, losing state funding this coming year. And I think one reason Jack and Roxanne are in this position is we put the request together and took it to our board in January, and then they saw the financials in March, which were a little better than we expected, frankly.
Okay, so I guess, Jack, you want to restate your motion, and what will happen is if that motion passes, then they're going to have to bring numbers and stuff back to us before we can actually vote on it. So this is just, would be direction to...
okay, this is with Michael's concurrence as a second, I guess,
Yeah.
but I'm taking on Roxanne's suggested amendment and change it so that for 2016 that the TBD board would fund Sunday service at a 50% level with the understanding that WTA would fund the other 50%. We would not lose Sunday service under this.
Okay. Motion been made and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No. Motion fails 2 to 5, right? Wasn't it 2 to 5? All those in favor, raise your hands. Okay. Motion fails 5 to 2. Okay, now is there a motion to extend for a year?
Well, I guess the alternative would be, is there enough support to go with a 1/3?
Not with me, but that's, I'm just speaking for myself.
Well,
That's
I'm just going to
fine.
throw it out there then. I'll have the same motion, but to put in 1/3 level, no, 2/3 level by a TBD board and 1/3 level by WTA.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
No. Motion carries 5 to 2. So staff will have to bring back that for
Yes.
another TBD meeting?
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll work with WTA, prepare the numbers, as well as probably a contract amendment for the board to formally approve.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, Jim, you want to do your thing here? We got,
He's got 10 minutes.
well, 5, 10 minutes.
5,
Yeah.
10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Jim McCabe, current chair of the Transportation Commission. You've seen a lot of this, so we'll zip through most of it because wearing your city council hats, it's come before you, particularly the stuff we did over the past year. I think the only notable thing here is that we're up to our 6th anniversary this year, and have been around long enough so that we'll have 2 commissioners that will be reach their term limits this year, and so we'll have 2 vacancies later on this year. Pretty much no change in the duties and authorities. The late addition on that was the TBD, because the TBD was created after the Transportation Commission. We'll sort of skip through these pretty quick because I'll talk mainly about the Fairhaven Parking Task Force, because you've seen all of the other ones as your normal council duties. So let's move on. I did want to show you this one again. Again, we've had some discussion both from Brian and Ted about the TBD funding going forward. This was out of the last year tip going forward, and the thing that stands out is that big green band in the 2014. In other words, that's the funding gap we're going to have to fill going forward from the TBD. And it's going to be in the next tip that's going to be developed this year that we're going to have to show, no funding from TBD from 2021 on. I think the other thing that's interesting to think about as the TBD board is if you all looked at that chart downstairs in the rotunda, what people like about Bellingham, community, parks, trails. I didn't see anything about TBD projects or bike lanes or anything like that. So I think as far as public awareness, that's something that the board needs to be thinking about going forward, because we're not going to have this TBD funding that we're heavily reliant on now if the public doesn't vote for it again, assuming that we put together another levy. Ted's talked about the TBD project specifically. We'll skip to, you're all familiar with the parking code revisions and those discussions. Let's move on. Bicycle master plan. I think the thing to, again, this gets back to TBD funding. As you know, the bicycle master plan was approved last year, and now that's really the framework for all of our non-motorized projects that come out of the TBD. But the thing to keep in mind is, as Brian and Ted have said, that we get about $1.5 million a year for non-motorized out of the TBD. We have $250 million in projects in the PED plan. We have close to $25 million in the bike plan. So you can do the math. That's 180 years of projects at our current funding level. And so that just emphasizes even more that if we don't have TBD funding going forward, we're going to have to find some new funding sources. Downtown plan, the only item in that's going to be coming up, and we'll get to that on our work plan, so let's just skip over that. The one thing that we did talk about at the last meeting at the TBD, or the TC, is that the Fairhaven Parking Task Force completed its work and completed its draft report and recommendations. It was reviewed and endorsed by the Transportation Commission at our earlier meeting this month. And I think the target is to have it come to the council later next month. So this was a long, drawn-out process, but very good public, business, community involvement, and very good support from Public Works. Okay, so that gives us to where we are now. Our normal projects that we have are approving, reviewing, and endorsing the TIP. TBD-funded projects, and again, we're looking forward, as you recall from the discussions earlier last fall, that we're looking at a 2-year time frame. We've got the provision for reserve funds so that we can go for matching funds, that sort of thing. One thing that I mentioned, that the Fairhaven Parking Task Force is going to be coming to council later on this month, or next month. You recall that as wearing your council hats, toward the end of last year, there was discussion of a, quote, new parking study. The Transportation Commission would like to be involved in that, depending on how that, the scope and the objectives of that come out. As I say, the one element of the city center recommendations, the city center neighborhood approval, was that the implementation strategies at the time hadn't been developed, and we expect to see those. And from all the boards downstairs too, we're going to be doing the update, 2016 update of the comp plan is beginning, or in process this year to be completed next year, and the Transportation Commission would like to participate in that, as well as the WTA strategic plan, either on a steering committee or some other mechanism. So that's what we're planning, and if there's anything else that you'd like to see the Transportation Commission get involved in, or questions on what we've done, I'd be happy to take them.
Well, right off the bat, that's the way you go through a slideshow. Thank you very much. I mean, everybody out there in the departments, take a look at this. Huh? Does anybody have any questions for Jim at all? Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 1, end of TBD board. Thank you very much.